It was the beginning of my second semester in 2016. I had a few new classes, but not many. In my first class, I met a guy named Ben. I had never seen him before, but he seemed very friendly. During class, Ben came over and asked for my phone number. He said he wanted to stay in touch and maybe discuss schoolwork. He seemed nice, so I gave him my number without thinking too much about it. After that day, Ben and I started texting every day. We exchanged simple messages about our classes, homework, and interests. In the hallways and during class, we talked about almost everything. But by the second week, he started talking to me less. He would just ask if I was okay and wave when he saw me. I didn't think much of it. By the third week, he only smiled and said hello occasionally. Then, in the fourth week, things started to feel strange. Ben began following me everywhere at school. No matter where I went, he was always nearby. Whenever I went to the bathroom, he would wait right outside the door, and when I came out, he would silently follow me. He never spoke, and his eyes always looked empty and distant, which made me uneasy. February had arrived, but Ben's behavior didn't change. He continued to follow me all day, making me feel like I was never truly alone. I tried everything to make him stop. I changed my walking routes between classes and even adjusted my schedule to avoid him. But no matter what I did, he was always there, watching me with that blank stare. I felt a mix of fear and frustration. Then, on Valentine's Day, Ben handed me a stuffed elephant without saying a single word, just like always. I thanked him, but he remained silent. That night, I received a text from him. When I opened it, my heart started racing. The message contained only one thing, my home address. I was terrified and furious. I couldn't sleep at all that night. I knew I had to do something, so I decided that the next morning, I would talk to my school counselor. The image of his blank stare was burned into my mind, and I felt foolish for waiting so long to speak up. Even though he had never physically hurt me, the fear inside me kept growing. After a restless night, I asked if I could come to school early the next morning. I knew I had to face this situation and get help. As soon as I arrived, I went straight to my counselor's office and told her everything. I explained how Ben had been following me and how the message with my home address made me feel unsafe. I even showed her the text. She listened carefully, took notes, and assured me that I had done the right thing by coming forward. When I left her office, a wave of dread hit me. Ben was in my first class, and I was afraid to walk in. But that morning, he was called to the counselor's office. When I realized he was gone, I felt relieved and was finally able to focus in class. For the rest of the day, I didn't see him. He wasn't lurking in the hallways, he wasn't outside my classes, he had disappeared. That first class was the last time I ever saw Ben. He never came back to school, and no one ever mentioned him again. It was as if he had never existed. I was relieved he was gone and that I no longer had to live in fear. I still have the stuffed elephant he gave me. It sits in the corner of my room, mostly ignored. Sometimes, I wonder if I should throw it away or just leave it there. Earlier today, I was scrolling through Instagram when I came across an ad for a memorial locket. It reminded me that I had wanted one a year ago to keep a small piece of my boyfriend's hair. A bit of backstory: back in August 2022, I started dating an amazing man. He was a little wild and loved riding his motorcycle, but he also had a kind heart. We had been together for months when, one day, a drunk driver hit him while he was riding his bike. He was on his way to pick me up for a date. He survived the crash but ended up in a coma for 3 weeks. I spent every one of those weeks by his side, holding his hand as he lay in the hospital bed, hoping for any sign of improvement. But instead of getting better, his condition worsened, and he eventually passed away due to complications from his treatment. His death happened just before we were supposed to celebrate our first Valentine's Day together, which made the loss even more painful. Losing him was one of the hardest things I've ever been through. I had always believed in the paranormal and was certain that if he was watching over me, he would send me a sign. But as time passed and nothing happened, I started doubting my beliefs about the afterlife. Then, last March, a friend from out of town visited a mutual friend and borrowed my car. In exchange, my friend and I switched vehicles. She rode a motorcycle. I hadn't ridden since the accident and had even sold my own bike, but this situation forced me to get back on one. One evening, as I was riding home, I listened to music through my helmet, finally feeling at ease on a bike again. Then, in my mind's eye, I saw him. He was standing on a bluff above me, one of his favorite spots. He had spent hours up there, looking out at the valley and the distant ocean. I could see him clearly, standing just as he used to, watching over me. As I rode past, I saw him waving at me, and I even heard him call my name. My heart pounded, but at the same time, I felt an unexpected sense of peace. I managed to get home safely, but I was overwhelmed by what had just happened. Once inside, I collapsed onto the living room floor, my dogs gathering around me, half of my riding gear still on. I even laughed a little, amazed by how real and surreal the experience had felt. Later that evening, as I was scrolling through my phone, I saw an ad for a memorial locket again. It hit me that I had never actually bought one, even though I had wanted to keep something of his close. I smiled sadly and thought, I should finally get that. Just before dinner, I turned on my TV to watch something from an internet streaming channel. I don't have cable because my landlord is cheap, so my TV only plays from streaming apps. But when I turned it on, the screen displayed my late boyfriend's favorite internet news website. At first, I was confused and turned to my current boyfriend, asking if he had set it up. He shook his head and said, "What is that?" My face went pale as I suddenly sat down, my hands trembling. This website wasn't easy to find, and as far as I knew, we had never watched it at my place, only at his. I was pretty sure it even required a login, so I had no idea how it had appeared on my screen. My boyfriend noticed my reaction and immediately came over, worried. He wrapped his arms around me and gently asked what was wrong. I could barely get the words out, but I whispered my late boyfriend's name. Tears welled in my eyes as I struggled to process what had just happened. Instead of brushing it off or trying to explain it away, my boyfriend just held me close. Then, without hesitation, he turned to the TV and said out loud, "Hi, Gary." I let out a shaky laugh and repeated the same words. A moment later, it dawned on me, this weekend would have been the 3rd anniversary of our first date. I don't know why it took him so long to send a sign, but now that it had finally happened, I was overwhelmed with so many emotions. When I was 17 and in my final year of school, I had to take the bus every day to get to school in the city. Every morning at the bus station, I noticed the bus driver. He always had a warm smile, and I secretly thought he was cute. One day, I got on the bus as usual. It was crowded, but I managed to find a seat near the middle. To my surprise, instead of sitting at the front like he normally did, the bus driver sat down right next to me. He looked at me and complimented my bag in a friendly way. I was a little confused since it wasn't common for a bus driver to randomly chat with a student. After that, he introduced himself, and we talked briefly about small things like the cold weather and our daily routines. Then, he got off the bus, and that was the end of our interaction, for the time being. A few months later, my school held its annual fundraiser event. Every year, senior students had to dress up and raise money for charity. That morning, we had to be at school by 6:45 a.m. to pick up commuters while still making it to class by 8:30 a.m. Because of this, I had to catch my bus around 6 a.m. to be on time. That day, my group had chosen a Bugsy Malone theme, so I was dressed as a 1920s flapper. When I got on the bus, I noticed the same bus driver again but didn't think much of it. After I sat down, the bus stopped at the next station. That's when the driver left his seat and came to sit next to me, despite the bus being empty. He started talking about how he used to be goth and then said I looked really nice. From there, he started another random conversation, asking about my taste in music. When I told him, he smiled and said, I knew we'd have so much in common. Around 6:20 a.m., I started to worry that I wouldn't make it to school on time. I felt uneasy and grew quiet, barely responding. Eventually, the driver got back into his seat and started driving again, but I could clearly see him watching me through the side mirror next to the driver's booth. He kept glancing at me the entire ride. After that strange encounter, I started seeing him everywhere. Every morning on my way to school, I'd pass by a row of benches usually occupied by homeless men, who sat quietly talking among themselves. But then, I began noticing the bus driver there too, sometimes sitting among them, sometimes just standing there. It felt like I kept spotting his face in the crowd. One day, as I walked past those benches, I saw him standing there, blending in with the homeless men. Now, I was seeing him both in the mornings and at the bus station. Of course, I still saw him while he was working and driving the bus, but what made things even more unsettling was that his homeless friends also started watching me. Whenever I walked by, they would stop talking and just stare, all because I had been kind to this bus driver. And that wasn't even the end of it. One afternoon, I was waiting at the bus station, chatting with a friend, when the driver came over to say hello. We exchanged a few polite words, but I had to leave quickly as my bus had arrived. I left him talking with my friend and didn't think much of it. Later that day, when I got home, my friend messaged me on Facebook. She told me that after I left, the bus driver had asked for my phone number, and she had given it to him. After that, he started texting me constantly. At first, I replied politely because I didn't want to be rude, but as time went on, his messages became unsettling. They made me feel uneasy, and on top of that, I had a lot of schoolwork to focus on. So, I slowly stopped responding, hoping he would get the hint. But he didn't stop. For 2 months, he texted me every single day, even when I didn't reply. Then, he started sending me pictures, not explicit ones, but photos of his house, showing all the different rooms, his car, and even his bike. Along with the pictures, he'd write things like, I have my own house and car. When he sent a photo of his bike, he added, I like riding my bike to work because it's healthier. Then, he told me where he lived, and I realized his home was on the opposite side of town. When we first met, he had no reason to be anywhere near my neighborhood. But over time, that changed. Around Valentine's Day, I started finding small gifts in my letterbox, every single day for 2 weeks. Teddy bears, chocolates, and other little presents. At first, I had no idea who was leaving them, but then I noticed the way he smirked at me whenever I saw him. That look on his face made me certain it was him. What made it even worse was the realization that my house was easy to spot from the bus stop. Every day, when I got off the bus, my home was right there in plain sight. That meant he had been watching me and knew exactly where I lived. After that, I did everything I could to avoid him. Whenever I saw him, I kept my distance. Thankfully, it seemed like he had switched to a different bus route, which was a huge relief. About a year later, I moved to a new place. But whenever I visit my mom, I still see his homeless friends around the city. They still stop and stare at me, just like before. And every time it happens, I feel that same unease all over again. About 8 months ago, I went on vacation with my family and a friend to Conan, Texas. We rented a nice Airbnb house for a week. The house had a large backyard filled with trees and bushes, making it the perfect place for hide and seek. My friend and I loved playing there since there were so many great hiding spots. For the first 2 days, my family, my friend, and I spent time together, going out to fish by the water and hike through the woods. On the third day, we returned to the house around 6 o'clock or 7 p.m. By then, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Since it was getting dark, we decided to play hide-and-seek in the woods behind the house. At the back of the house, there was a door leading to a small patio. The patio had a roof and screened windows, making it feel like a tiny enclosed room. Stepping out of it, you could see the backyard. To the left, the forest stretched out, and in the far left corner of the yard, a path led into the woods. That was our usual spot for playing. There was also a small shed on the left side of the house, sitting right next to the trees. By now, it was around 8 p.m. We had been playing for a while, and the sky was completely dark. The only sources of light were the moon, my phone's flashlight, and a dim patio light. But once you stepped into the forest, that little bit of light almost completely disappeared. We had been playing for nearly an hour when it was my turn to find him. This part is important. My friend hid near the shed, which was right by the tree line, but not actually in the woods. Of course, I didn't know that at the time. As I walked deeper into the trees, I decided to start recording on my phone. After searching for about 2 minutes, I started to lose hope and called out his name. Silence. For about 3 seconds, there was nothing. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a high-pitched screech about 40 feet away, slightly to my right. At first, I assumed it was him, so I moved toward the sound, expecting him to jump out and scare me. The forest around me was eerily quiet, except for that strange noise. But something felt off. I was deep in the trees now, and the sound had clearly come from ahead of me, not behind, where my friend was hiding near the shed. That meant it wasn't him. A few seconds later, I called his name again. Javi. The same noise responded, but this time, it was even higher, almost like a whistle. A cold chill ran down my spine. I tried to brush it off and forced a nervous laugh, though I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping over me. I called out again, a little louder this time. That's when whatever was making the sound responded again. It let out a long, eerie howl, stretched out and unnatural. But what truly terrified me was that it sounded closer. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I turned and ran. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted through the dark woods. Bro, stop. This isn't funny. I shouted, my voice shaking. The dry leaves crunched beneath my feet as I raced back toward the backyard, barely daring to glance over my shoulder. When I finally reached the yard, I grabbed my flashlight with trembling hands and pointed it toward the shed, right where my friend had been breaking sticks earlier. Before I could say anything, he suddenly jumped out, trying to scare me. I stumbled back, still catching my breath, my mind racing. Was that you making those noises? I asked. Did you hear it too? His playful expression vanished. I thought that was you, he said, his voice suddenly serious. We stood there in silence for a moment, listening. The woods were completely still now. It was as if whatever had been making the noise had disappeared. Or maybe it was still out there, watching us. Let's go inside, I muttered, my stomach twisting with unease. Without another word, my friend nodded, and we hurried toward the house. But even after stepping inside and locking the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there.